This legislation update is it's going to be presented by myself and by Jenny. I'm going to start by talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation. This act was first introduced by Romeo Saganash as a private member's bill, I believe in 2008. It was then reintroduced in the next government and then reintroduced again for a third time in the first iteration of the Liberal government in 2015. It died on the order paper. It got close enough in the previous government to die on the order paper in the Senate. And it would be noted that there was broad approval for that particular piece of legislation, and it was effectively killed in the Senate, led by conservative senators and specifically by Dennis Patterson. It then came back in this particular government as a Liberal Party bill, so a government bill. And we worked in partnership with the Minister of Justice on the co-development of this legislation with the Assembly of First Nations and the Métis National Council. It was in the mandate letter to the Minister of Justice, and it also was in the Liberal Party's platform in 2019. And so we had the ability to work directly with government on this bill, and that was something that was a departure from the previous iterations of the legislation, in which Inuit were more supportive of the Romeo Saganash's efforts rather than working directly with government. ITK released a position paper entitled Establishing an Indigenous Human Rights Commission through Federal UN Declaration Legislation in June of 2020. This was an addendum to the 2017 position paper that ITK had put forward based on its positions on potential United Nations Declaration legislation in this country. There was not a lot of support for ITK's positions, especially in relation to the Indigenous Human Rights Commissioner amongst First Nations and Métis co-developers. In the end, though, ITK was successful in ensuring that there was a provision that demands that within the action plan of the for the implementation of UNDRIP legislation, that recourse and remedy will be key components of an implementation plan. And we have every hope now that we are working with the same government in a minority setting to implement the act, that recourse and remedy provisions will be addressed, especially in relation to ITK's longstanding demand for an Indigenous Human Rights Commission that would ensure that our existing rights are upheld within Canada. We worked also with the Department of Justice to ensure that the consultations for this piece of legislation were conducted in the best possible way. And I believe that there were consultations across Inuit Nunangat and with Inuit leadership in the run-up to the legislation. It passed royal assent on June 21st, 2021. And now we are in a place where we will get to work on the creation of an action plan. The Government of Canada has 2 years to develop this action plan, but it is our hope that that action plan will be produced in a much tighter timeline. Also, that ITK will continue to work with regions to ensure that the ITK positions brought forward and the space for Inuit is still maintained throughout the course of the development of the action plan. Moving on to the Act respecting Indigenous languages. This is a piece of legislation that was passed in the now 2 parliaments ago, but it just came into, parts of the Act came into force in 2019, and then the balance of the Act came into force in October 1, 2020. The Indigenous Language Commissioner and the directors were announced on June 14th of last summer, and we are proud that Robert Watt is the Inuit director within the Commission of Indigenous Languages. There are 3 other directors, including the commissioner, which is now Ronald Ignace. It is the expectation that Métis, First Nations, and Inuit will rotate turns as commissioner as this particular commission undertakes its work. And so we look forward to working with Director Watt on the number of different Inuktitut considerations and positions that ITK and the Inuit land claim regions have. The concerns around official language status, which came to fore in the debates leading up to the election just these couple of weeks ago. Also in relation to access to education, access to government services, including health services, and then also language promotion and inequities in relation to funding. All of these things now we can pursue in another venue, in addition to the venues that we already have at our disposal. We also have been working through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee to create clear Inuktitut costing analysis for each of the 4 land claim regions in relation to the ability to administer government services and other key duties in Inuktitut. This is something that we hope will translate into increased federal funding for the ability for Inuit to access services in Inuktitut and also to learn and be educated in Inuktitut. I'll now pass it to Jenny for the distinctions-based health legislation. We'll go through each of these legislative items and then we'll open up the floor for conversation.
Thank you, President Obed. So as you are aware, in March of 2021, the ITK Board of Directors met and agreed to a process, key priority areas, and a funding allocation for the distinctions-based Indigenous health legislation. Since the last update that was provided to you in June, ITK has completed the ITK-led engagement sessions within each Inuit region, as well as the urban Inuit organizational engagement, and as President Pottle noted in his remarks, the National Inuit Youth Council engagement. The firm that we have hired to assist with this work, Gowling WLG, are currently revising the draft discussion paper to include the information gained from the engagement sessions, and this is expected in early November. Due to the federal election, discussions are currently on hold until such time as a new minister has been selected and that minister has been briefed by staff at Indigenous Services Canada. However, we have been informed that once that does take place, we will be able to have some discussions with the federal government related to revised timelines and the co-development process. As you're also aware, ITK requested in the elections priorities document to see a bill tabled in spring of 2022 with respect to this legislation. Each of you appointed working group members, and we will be in touch with them as soon as we have further information from the federal government to begin the co-development process. I'll move on to an update related to an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. So the act came into force on January 1st of 2020 after much work had taken place with land claim organizations, Paktuti Inuit Women of Canada, the National Inuit Youth Council, and ICC Canada. It was also added to the ICPC Legislative Priorities Work Plan, and that work plan was approved at the leaders meeting with the Prime Minister in April of 2021. The Ad Hoc Child Welfare Working Group has been working very hard with Indigenous Services Canada to undertake technical discussions related to implementation. They have recently met in both June and this month to discuss topics such as terms and definitions that are outlined in the legislation, as well as the development of a data strategy. Upcoming discussions include funding, including not just for implementation, but also investments that need to be made within the current child welfare system. Approaches to child intake, as well as regulations. The National Inuit Committee on Health directed ITK to hire a consultant to undertake a legislative review and compare provincial and territorial legislation with that of the federal legislation to ensure that the minimum standards outlined within the federal legislation are met within provincial and territorial legislation. We have recently completed the review of the Newfoundland and Labrador legislation, which was shared with Nunavut, as well as the other organizations. And we are moving on to reviewing the Government of Nunavut's child welfare legislation at the request of NTI. Additionally, we've been undertaking work related to an Inuit data strategy. We are utilizing the Ad Hoc Child Welfare Working Group as part of this work. And this is to address Section 28 of the legislation, which speaks to information sharing agreements, and which also was a commitment stemming from the January 2018 meeting called by the federal government, the emergency meeting to address the high rate of Indigenous children within the child welfare system. A data strategy was one of the commitments that the federal government made at that meeting. Page 6 of your briefing note provides a status update related to the serving of notice under Section 20. And we did hear yesterday and today from Nunavut related to the work that they are now undertaking with respect to drawing down jurisdiction as well. Indigenous Services Canada released a call for proposals in March of 2021 for readiness to exercise jurisdiction and or to develop legislation systems, etc., prior to entering into coordination agreements that are outlined in the legislation. At any point in time, a land claim organization can put forward a proposal. And in speaking to the discussions yesterday related to the listed community and Ontario, this would be an opportunity to attempt to gain additional funding from the federal government to undertake some of that work as a listed community. And ITK is very happy to work with land claim organizations on any proposals that you would like to submit to Indigenous Services Canada related to that. ITK did submit a proposal to undertake the work related to the legislative review, as well as to coordinate work on the governance engagement mechanism sessions that are taking place. And we have recently heard that that proposal was approved. Finally, I wanted to note that the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy Working Group has transitioned to having monthly webinars instead of their annual in-person Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse Forum. And the topic that they have selected for these webinars for this year will focus on practice and service delivery in relation to implementation of the federal legislation and prevention of child sexual abuse. Tracy will speak more to this later, but we will be having individuals and experts come to speak to the working group about how others have been implementing programs and services within their own child welfare systems, Indigenous child welfare systems that address child sexual abuse. I'll turn it back to President Obed.
Thanks, Jenny. And then the final update in relation to federal legislation that affects Inuit is in relationship to the Citizenship Act. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 94, which called to amend the oath of citizenship, was finally amended. We provided input in 2016, in 2017, and then again in 2020, just in relation to in the Inuit perspectives on the proposed changes. In the briefing note, there is text now that has replaced the old oath of citizenship, and it's basically recognizes the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So any new Canadian has to say these words to become a Canadian, and the inclusion of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis, and the reference to Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, just I think grounds new Canadians in a better way. The amendment that we had hoped for was in relation to the very specific United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples wording, which called for constructive agreements rather than just something that was treaty rights, because the terminology for new Canadians may be lost on the differences between historic First Nations treaties and modern land claim agreements for Inuit. But in the larger picture, it is good that this piece has been amended, and it passed with royal assent on June 21st, 2021. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on this particular issue, and while ITK has broadly endorsed all of the calls to action and has directed ITK to work on their implementation, this was something that was in relation to that direction, and so we wanted to share that update with all of you.